So good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Tracy Rawling Church. I'm co-chair of the Reading Climate Action Network, and we're organising Reading Climate Festival. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion on COP26, which is hosted by Extinction Rebellion Reading. So the way we're going to work this is I will lead the questions for about the first hour or so, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for your questions. So our panellists will discuss how they became involved in the climate movement, what they regard as the priorities at this year's COP26, and what role government, industry and the press play in keeping us informed about climate change and taking appropriate action. Unfortunately, one of our advertised speakers, Clare Farrell, has found herself in a location without Wi-Fi, so she can't join us tonight. But we do have a fantastic panel of speakers who'll be sharing their perspective on COP26 and climate change. And I'll introduce them to you now. So panelists, other than Jon, because you're invisible, please give us a wave as I mention you. So first of all, we have Ackroyd and Harvey, so that's Heather and Dan. And they create works that intersect art, activism, biology, ecology and history, referencing memory and time, nature and culture, urban political ecologies and biosphere degradation. Their time-based practice reveals an intrinsic bias towards process and event. And in 2019, they co-founded Culture Declares Emergency, a movement of nearly 2,000 artists and organisations who've declared a climate and ecological emergency. So Jon Fuller, who is still unfortunately unable to show himself, has been an active eco-campaigner for 40 years. After COP21 in Paris, he founded Climate Genocide Act Now to seek new legislation to prosecute those who kill by causing climate breakdown. He specialises in the way the media portrays XR and the climate and ecological emergency. Then we have Poppy Harding. So Poppy is a lecturer at the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway University of London, and her research covers a broad range of climate science, including impacts of climate change on sensitive ecosystems and past human climate interactions over the past 30,000 years. And then finally, we have Todd Smith. So Todd's a former airline pilot who's now an XR spokesperson and co-founder of Safe Landing, a worker-led movement to highlight false solutions, counteract unrestrained growth, and explore ideas around a just transition in aviation. So my first question for all of you is, when did you first become aware of the seriousness of climate change? So should we start with Todd?
Thanks very much, Tracy. Yeah, for me, it was actually a number of things, I guess. I was never climate aware. I remember being in flight training at London Metropolitan University. I think it was a G20 protest just after the 2008 crash, and feeling a bit guilty because I was studying to become a pilot, but not really connecting the dots. And when I had my medical revoked about 3.5 years ago from flying with Thomas Cook, one of the reasons that left me medically grounded was a diagnosis of Lyme disease, which has become much more prevalent in the UK due to our milder winters and warmer summers. And at the same time, you know, whilst I was off, of course, I was hypocritically using my staff travel benefits to go and see, you know, South America, Southeast Asia, and I witnessed the effects firsthand of climate change and mass tourism. And the thing that stuck out to me most was seeing Rainbow Mountain in Peru, which is 100 meters lower than Everest Base Camp, and it's been so-called discovered in the last couple of years because the snow's melted, and it's revealed this beautifully coloured rainbow mountain. But of course, it's bittersweet because we shouldn't be able to see it at all. And Peru was one of the first countries to be hit. So yeah, I guess it was a number of things, and obviously XR was the rise of XR was happening in London, and I felt compelled to understand the science. And yeah, when I did, you know, I felt you know, I think COVID was the final straw for me, and decided to take action. So
fantastic, thank you for sharing that. Can we go next to Poppy? Have we lost Poppy? Okay, let's go to Heather.
1988, I remember it very, very well. It was a hot summer. And James E. Hansen, who at the time was at NASA, a leading atmospheric scientist, he just said, you know what, I'm 99% sure, my colleagues are, from the science we're doing, that the greenhouse effect, as it was then called, is as a result of our activities of burning fossil fuel. And it just seared into my head and into my thoughts. And I just thought, yeah, I understood it. It was almost just, there was no question for me. There has been subsequently, just because you want to test your belief, or you want to test the facts that you're being delivered, and because of the power and persuasion of the denial camps. But actually, I ended up making a life-sized camel, and its coat was living fresh grass, and it was a hot summer. In fact, 1988 was against one of the hottest summers, particularly America. North America was really, really suffering. And this grass coat withered to this beautiful hay color, and it even smelled like a camel, I thought, not that I've got that close. So at the time I was saying, maybe we'll be, maybe we have to start to have more camels. I was sort of thinking in 30, 40 years time, not anticipating the level of floods that was going to be happening, not anticipating the deluges that were happening. I was tending to see it as a kind of a rise of heat, dryness, as if the desert would enter into the UK. And we know it's way more complex and wicked than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So let's go to Dan next.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, I became more acutely aware of it in the 1980s, but I was brought up a vegetarian by activist parents who were part of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the Aldermaston marches and things. And so I think, a lot of my work was around observing nature too and things. So you start to pick up on things, because the science around climate change has been around since the 1880s and things. It's not new. I mean, the global greenhouse effect was being spoken about before. It's just, it never really got anywhere near mainstream up until maybe a couple of years ago, not even the 80s. I think there was always a lot of sort of diverse information being put out there to muddy the waters around the reality of what was happening. But yeah, we certainly know where we are now.
Yes, unfortunately we do. So Poppy, would you like to share your thoughts next?
Yeah, sorry, I think my internet was a bit unstable.
Yes, your sound's not great.
For a minute, but for me, really, I think when I first really kind of knew it was, sorry, yes, I might just try and get back into the call and see if it.
Yeah, we'll go to Jon and come back
better
to you if that's okay. And the great news is we can now see Jon, so that's wonderful. So Jon, if we can go to you next, and we'll see if Poppy can get a better line. You're on mute. We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Yeah. All right. Is that okay? Right. Sorry about the IT problems. I used my laptop just a couple of days ago on Zoom and it was fine. So I don't know what's happened. I have been involved in the environmental movement for about 40 years, but I think because of the topic tonight about the media, I think I'll probably quickly mention that I really came into full-scale conflict with the media in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, the UK suffered the European Union. We had the worst child pedestrian fatality rate in the whole of the EU, and it was an issue that was barely covered at all in the press. But there was an attempt by the John Major government to try and tackle speeding on Britain's roads and try and make Britain's roads safer. And the media attacked the John Major government relentlessly. It was the Red Tops primarily that were responsible for this, but particularly the Sun newspaper. So he didn't really make much progress. And then Tony Blair was elected, and he considered looking at the possibility of tackling road safety, but again was vehemently attacked by the media. And so he didn't really want to act on the issue because it was just going to be far more trouble and grief than it was worth. And so there were a number of road safety campaigns that have been battling to try and tackle road safety. And I was part of that movement. And we weren't making any progress. So I went off to one more radical side and organised much more dynamic campaigning in Tony Blair's constituency, including a mass leaflet drop to every home in his constituency. And within a month of that, he changed his policies because it was very hard-hitting material. It was all about politicians and the press and who kills, you know, more children. And it was very hard-hitting indeed. And Tony Blair announced one of his many targets, and he said that he would introduce a new policy to halve the number of children killed and seriously injured on Britain's roads within 10 years. And then we started seeing more speed cameras and speed bumps, that kind of thing. And then the press absolutely attacked the Blair government, portraying them as being anti-motorist. And so the next stage of the campaign was to actually take on the editor of The Sun. And I won't go into too much detail now, but I will say that we wrote to every MP in the UK asking for a special piece of legislation called Wade's Law. The editor of The Sun at that time was Rebecca Wade, and it would require every newspaper to have a cigarette-style warning box on any article that mentioned road safety. And that box would simply say the number of children killed in the last year by speeding motorists. And it would be called Wade's Law. And it was very, if you think it through, that's actually a very hard-hitting piece of campaigning. And it shut up The Sun for about 8 months. And that was enough for Tony Blair to get in place the measures that he needed to deliver his 10-year program. The target was hit 3 years early. After 7 years, we'd halved the number of children killed and seriously injured on Britain's roads, and we'd saved the lives of 540 children. It was a very painful campaign for all involved, and nobody, or hardly anybody in the country, knows anything about it. But that was, for me, one of the most educational things I've been involved in with the press, is that if they do not want to give you something, you have to fight damn hard, really hard, to get it.
Okay, thank you. So Poppy has just come back in, and I'm hoping that she might be able to make herself heard this time. Would you like to unmute yourself and try to tell us when you first became aware of the seriousness of climate change, Poppy?
Hi, is that any better?
It is
so
better.
For me,
I think we can work with that.
I first became, okay. So I think for me, I was of the generation that grew up and got taught global warming at school. And I remember thinking that was pretty terrifying, and why weren't we all panicking about that a little bit more? And I think for that, for me, fueled my interest in geography, because that's when we were getting taught that. And I went off to university, and within the first week of my geography degree, I started to read a lot of these academic papers that were talking about climate change. And yeah, that for me was the real point when you're like, crikey, wow, we've got something to be doing here. And yeah,
brilliant, thank you. Sorry, I'm finding you're cutting in and out, Poppy, and I'm not sure whether it's you or me now, so that's
on ever since, really.
Is everyone else hearing Poppy okay?
I'm getting freezing this end. So.
Yeah, I think you're still cutting in and out a little bit. So I think we got most of the gist of that. So thank you. So moving on then to think about the current kind of scenario. We've had recent reports on eco-anxiety, and particularly the impacts of climate change on young people, and the recent UNICEF report that 1 billion children are at acute risk due to climate right now. So would anyone in our panel like to share their thoughts on what the climate movement should do to support youth well-being? I'll leave you to self-select on this one. Heather, thank you. You're muted.
Yeah, this morning, through Culture Declares Emergency, which is for a very broad across museums, libraries, well-being, the arts, theatre, culture, music, orchestras, to come forward and be part of an extended community. And there's been a real wonderful increase of people who have been declaring a climate and ecological emergency recently. And this morning, there was 50 people on Zoom, and it was really, really fantastic to hear the initiatives that are happening through the arts and through museums around COP26. But there was a specific question about the well-being, the mental health, the emotional well-being of children. And already you could see these wonderful alliances starting to be made just through that relatively small but very strong and visionary group of people. So to some extent, it's a part of a much bigger picture. But I think allowing children to really work through the imagination and through the arts is a really healthy step forward and way to go forward. So I will let you know how that develops over the next few weeks.
Yeah, it would be great to have an update on that. Would anybody else like to take that question? Jon, yes.
One of the points that came out of the research by Bath University was that a lot of young people were suffering greater anxiety because they didn't feel that adults, and particularly politicians, were taking the issue seriously. And this was making their suffering far worse. They had to live through something that was quite frightening, but they didn't know the details about it. And one of the thoughts that struck me listening to the lead researcher on this was that the vast majority of young people really don't know just what is going to hit them in their lifetimes. And they don't know some of the exceptionally cruel features of climate breakdown and the politics around climate breakdown. One particular point I'll just simply draw to people's attention, and that is that we are very likely going to go through the 1.5 degrees Celsius target by around about 2030. If you watch Sky TV, the Daily Climate Show, they'll tell you it'll be, I think it's 2032. But it's not that far off. Now, COP21 is predicated on the notion that the young have to pay for carbon removal from the atmosphere. When we go over 1.5, they have to pay to remove enough carbon dioxide to bring us back down to 1.5. And the idea is they have to start paying from the year 2050 onwards. This vast debt has to be paid in the second part of this century because the politicians who negotiated COP21 were not willing to pay it now. This is probably the greatest act of theft there has ever been in human history, to transfer such a vast debt from us today. If we decide to jump in our planes, jump in a car, have a leisure trip, whatever it may be, we are effectively passing to the young the bill to remove from the atmosphere the carbon dioxide associated with that. So the young not only have to put up with climate breakdown and everything that entails, they also have to pay a vast sum for carbon removal from 2050 onwards. And what has struck me is that hardly any young person understands that. Hardly any part of the population understands that, let alone a young adult. And it struck me that just how upsetting that is for young people to know that they're not only being thrown under a bus, but if there are any survivors, they're going to be handed the bill for the diesel. It's just so cruel. And it is almost so cruel, it's beyond comprehension that any politician would negotiate such a deal knowing what it meant for their own children. So that was what struck me about that particular research. And I think that eco-anxiety and depression would be far worse if the young actually knew just how awful it is. So that's all I really wanted to say on that point.
Okay, Jon, that's a sobering thought. Does anyone else on the panel? Yes, Todd, you have a view.
Hi, yeah. Just to give a little bit of context, I identify as someone that suffers from climate anxiety. My psychotherapist is Caroline Hickman from the Climate Psychology Alliance, who does a fantastic amount of work with the youth. And just to give a little bit of context to the actual condition, you know, I'm sure the government would love to pathologize climate anxiety as, you know, a mental health disorder, which would put the onus on the individual. But it's very much, you know, if we see the action from government, from our leaders, a proportionate action, then the anxiety is immediately relieved. So yeah, it's absolutely you know, important to make that clear that, you know, it's the government and our leaders that are causing this unnecessary suffering of our youth. And you know, for me, I feel like you know, I've been through a grieving process of understanding climate science and having to almost mourn the loss of this collapse that we find ourselves in. But I do feel that once you can connect to that emotionally and really feel what's going on, if you can move through that, it gives you more resilience to be able to show up in your activism as best you can. So I guess one thing I hear Caroline say a lot is, as someone that's a little older than myself, she will always make sure that she apologizes to the youth that she talks to first and foremost for being complicit for so long in this collapse. And I guess, you know, from the optimal thing as adults, what we can do is ultimately do our best to ensure that, you know, the government does take action, validate the youth's emotions, ensuring that the regenerative culture is maintained throughout the movement, and you know, yeah, just keep acting proportionally to, you know, the problem that we're faced with.
Yes, thank you, Todd. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that if you understand the problem and it doesn't make you feel anxious, then that's then you're possibly more in need of mental support than somebody who does suffer from climate anxiety. So Heather has very helpfully published in the chat some research from Caroline Hickman, so thank you very much for that, Heather. I think we'll move on to the next question. And we've seen a lot of disruption on the motorways this week, and that's certainly got the media's attention. So I would be really interested to hear the panelists' views on Insulate Britain. Who would like to start with that one? Todd, thank you.
I've been following it quite closely, and you know, obviously the media will do the same thing that they always do, which is, you know, delegitimize you know, what these people are doing, ultimately risking their lives, and make the story an attack, and, you know, try to yeah, just, you know, distract the public from the reality of the message that they're trying to portray. I think Insulate Britain have been quite successful so far in the media interviews that I've seen, in really sort of bursting the media bubble. And for me, it does actually, it's quite simple in its messaging, and because it appeals to the working class, given that it's, you know, pound for pound the best way that we can reduce emissions in the UK. And ultimately it helps with fuel poverty, when, you know, we've just seen this spike, and 28,000 elderly deaths in the winter, excess deaths occurring currently already. So the government always seems so keen to, you know, pile our taxpayers' money into these big, grandiose, you know, green new technology infrastructure, for instance, but, you know, there's really simple things, the low-hanging fruit. You know, and you know, I think every agency or NGO has said that insulating Britain is, you know, the best thing to do. So it's just really calling out the government on you know, the greenwash and the deception tactics that they have. And yeah, it's interesting to see how it's unfolding at the moment. It's obviously, you know, difficult because people will be affected by this, you know, who are stuck in traffic. And you know, I think Insulate Britain have done a good job to validate and accept that, you know, that is, you know, horrible, and they don't want to be doing that. But yeah, obviously, you know, the mainstream media are tough cookie to crack. So yeah, I think generally, you know, although I'm not involved directly, I do absolutely support that need to shift the Overton window and to get these simple messages out to highlight how bad a job the government are doing of protecting us and basically serving big business over people and you know, the social care system. So
thank you, Todd. I've seen Jon nodding along, and I know that you have views about the media, so I feel like you'd like to come in here.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with what Todd has said there. I study the right-wing press most days of the week, and it's really quite shocking. Unless you're used to it, it's quite shocking, the vitriol and abuse directed at people involved in Insulate Britain. And of course, prior to that, at Extinction Rebellion, people are named as individuals, and there's been some quite nasty stuff concerning two of the vicars who've been involved in the actions. They're being named, and you know, quite abusive, infantile remarks directed at them. And I think that what the right-wing press tends to do is to focus upon the disruption and attack people for causing disruption, and talk about the inconvenience to motorists, a little bit about potential risk to the protesters. But really, as Todd says, if you actually read the newspapers, there is so little about the actual cause. Now, the data I've seen is 8,500 excess deaths due to cold homes in the winter, 2 winters ago. Now, 8,500 people killed who didn't need to be killed. Now, that really should be headline news fairly regularly, and it should certainly be high up on the agenda during the course of these protests. But we don't have an impartial media. There are vested interests here at play, where any protester that is perceived to have a success, then that will unravel a series of problems as far as the right-wing press is concerned. The Telegraph is the major paper that is concerned about any effort at all to restrict the rights of the motorist. It sees any attack on the motorist as precisely that. Any effort to control pollution, to make safe neighbourhoods, they see it as a war on the motorist or an attack upon the motorist, and they portray it that way. But the right-wing press do not talk about the issue, and they most certainly don't talk about the simple solution that we need to have in the UK, even if you accept a 2050 target. The simple solution is you need a national home insulation programme. So even if you don't support groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, and you want to go for a 2050 target, you still need to have that national home insulation programme. If you don't have that, you won't even hit your 2050 target. So the press, the right-wing press, don't even talk about that. That's not on their agenda at all. So this is one of the great problems we have, is that a huge proportion of the British population don't understand the issues. And they don't understand the issues because the agenda has been set by the right-wing press, which is largely picked up by the main broadcasters, BBC and ITV. So that's how the media links into all of this. We, as an environmental movement, climate activists, we have an enormous uphill battle just to try and get the basics of our message out there. Because anything we try to do, we will be held down by very powerful billionaires, the billionaires who own the media.
Thank you, Jon. I can see that Dan's bursting to come in there. So
no, I think, I mean, we know what most of the press is like. I mean, there have been 21 people on hunger strike outside the Houses of Parliament for a long time about Insulate Britain, and it gets nowhere. It doesn't get picked up on. So actions like what is happening around the M25 is a necessity. It does get it onto the mainstream press, even if the BBC report it in a very biased way, but it's getting it out there and it needs to be spoken about. So, you know, and this thing of holding up ambulances and things, you know, there's one lane always free for emergency vehicles. They can get through. There's a lot of spin put on it, and we just need more and more people to keep going. I'm amazed how they kept on coming back and not disappearing. So Fingers crossed.
Thanks, Dan. I think Heather would like to come in too.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's a broad orchestration of actions and activities. And I think Insulate Britain, yes, it has done something dramatic, disruptive, and it has brought it into the national consciousness. And yes, it will be divisive, as Jon has been pointing out, as we know, because of the terrible bias that the press has. But it is a wider orchestration. Even within the movement, there will be people within the movement who it will not sit comfortably with. We had a long discussion about this yesterday at our Dorking and Reigate, Monday night, Dorking and Reigate. And, you know, I was saying, well, listen, you know, some of the more peaceful militant aspects of the suffragettes smashed, you know, they put a brick through the orchid house at Kew Gardens. And there will always be a part of a very strongly held, you know, and especially when we're in a code red for humanity now, that we have to take very, very strong steps. It will not always be palatable, but it is by necessity. And we've been put in this position. It's not by, you know, we have, the position has been forced by the denial, by the press, and by the reluctance. So, you know, I do support what Insulate Britain are doing.
Okay, thank you. Poppy, I don't know whether you want to come in on this one. I can't see you at the moment, but feel free to unmute yourself if you've got a view.
I'll see if you can hear me, but I agree with lots of things the others have said. But from a science perspective, again, it just comes back that, yeah, we absolutely need to be doing these retrofitting changes in our homes, and we have to hold the government to doing those things.
Yeah,
so yeah, that's all I'll say. Just my internet is still unstable, but we do have to be pushing.
It is interesting. I mean, in the work that we do with the Reading,
it's not to be mainstream news.
Oh, Poppy, we are struggling to hear you, I'm afraid. Yeah, insulation is an interesting one. In the work that we do with the Reading Climate Action Network, it's very clear that, you know, insulation of the existing housing stock, it has by far the biggest impact, you know, compared to all the kind of higher profile things like zero carbon building standards, which, you know, that most of the properties that will be here in 2050 are already built. So actually optimizing those gives us a far better advantage, and it's such a no-brainer. But it's amazing that it doesn't get more support. So I think we're probably all agreed that national leaders are not stepping up to the challenge. But of course, climate policy needs to be not only national but also local and international. So I wonder if you could talk about how these different policy areas might be harmonised and united strategically going forward. Who'd like to pick that one up? Heather, go on.
Okay, well, I'm just going to say that Dorking, Mole Valley District Council declared a climate emergency back in 2019. And yes, of course, you know, as we all were put into, put on ice for a while, but melting ice. But they're actually doing a lot of really good local initiatives. And, you know, there's representation from Extinction Rebellion, from all manner of different civil society, different organizations are all moving to do something. So I think that local aspect is really, really important. And, you know, we do have a very good, I mean, at the moment, it's the Liberal Democrats who are leading, who you know, kind of have charge at the moment of Mole Valley. And so, you know, we're trying to support and do what we can. And it's a shared, you know, there can be 20, 25 of us at any point, you know, and people come up and take responsibilities, put suggestions, ideas in where they can. So I feel this is promising.
I think it is encouraging to see how much is actually being done at local level, but I suppose the challenge is, how do we connect that up, first of all with national policy, and then beyond that with international policy, so that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction? I don't know whether Jon has a view on that.
Yes, I'd just quickly like to mention that on the international side, we in the UK have a huge problem because we go around in the UK telling everybody that we've cut our emissions by 42% since 1990. Whereas international negotiators know that that's not really true. And in fact, our emissions cuts since 1990 are about 11% if you factor in aviation, shipping, and the embedded emissions in all the products that we import from abroad. So that doesn't cut any mustard with the negotiators who turn up to COP26. And the second thing is that the UK has industrialized 200 years before China. And our historical emissions are enormous compared with most other countries. On a historical basis, they're 19 times greater for the average British person than the average person in China. And despite that historical injustice, we are still talking about opening a new coal mine. We're still talking about a massive new road building program. We're opening new oil wells. There's talk of a huge new oil well in off Shetlands. There are a number of smaller ones that are actually being open right now that few people know about. So it's coal, oil. We're still trying to get out of the ground. And we're still talking about expansion of aviation. These policies deter other countries from making a huge effort. We give the message to the rest of the world that business as usual and comforts and all the luxuries we enjoy now must carry on uninterrupted, but where it's convenient for us to do so, where there's a new technology that allows us to carry on as before, then we will deploy that new technology, whether it be wind power, solar power, whatever it may be. But we are kicking the can down the road on all the hard choices, all the hard options. And if we do it here in the UK with our bad record on emissions, then other countries that are not as guilty as we are, why should they make a bigger effort than we do? So the problem that we face at COP is that the UK sets a very bad example. It pretends that it sets a good example, but it actually sets a bad example. And that will definitely slow down progress at COP26. I cannot see how we will get the outcome that we need if we carry on if the British government carries on with the pretense that it is carrying on with. And I've just seen somebody put in there the comments box, what about high speed 2? You're absolutely right. What about high speed 2? That price estimate for that has just gone up to £98 billion. And that would go a long way to insulating all the homes in the UK.
And probably create more jobs than HS2 does as well, I imagine. Dan?
Yeah, just on a level with some of the things at COP, there's a friend of ours, Bill Dunster, the architect from BedZ, Zero Emission Buildings. He applied to have a stall about zero emission buildings at COP26. He was told that he was too small as a company, and they have given out some of these stands to home builders and people who have never built zero emission buildings in their life. But this is a guy who's an expert at it, and he's not allowed in to have a stand there because he's too small. But anyway, I'll let anyone make up their minds about that, about who's leading.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So actually, I'm going to stay with you and Heather for a moment because we're going to start looking at kind of subject matter experts for a little while. So could one of you tell us a little bit more about Culture Declares Emergency?
I am here. I just close it down for a little while. So Culture Declares Emergency launched in 2019, April 2019. It was very much born from Extinction Rebellion. Many of us some of us knew each other. There were lots of people that we discovered in, through the arts as well. But it was also born from the youth strikes, Fridays for the Future, Greta Thunberg's presence, but also it does have a greater legacy, going back, to the last 30, 40 years, where we've been trying to put the climate and the environment into the center of the cultural landscape. But it's always been sort of kept at a very at a distance. But it has really, really shifted. And Extinction Rebellion supported the launch with a pocket of money and also really great press support. And also Rebels supported the locking down of Waterloo Bridge. So coming to now, we're moving towards 2,000 organizations and artists who have declared. As I say, we're abroad, you know, across from orchestras, musicians, through to museum. And if you are involved in culture in any capacity, then please register, please declare. You know, we have working groups. It can be, you can put in as much as you so wish, but it's very active actually, and there's some really good things happening. And actually over the last 2 years, there's also Architects Declare Emergency, which is extraordinary, have some of the Starling Prize winners, big arguments and confrontations around building of airports. Music declares emergency, worldwide, global names who are doing a huge amount of work. Heritage has declared emergency, business has declared emergency, you know, health has declared emergency. And so actually it's really, it's a sort of much broader movement. So there's an ecology of declarer movements, which is fantastic. But yeah, Culture Declares Emergency. The website is being updated at the moment. But there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of activity happening, sort of, you know, kind of there and also behind the scenes as well.
That's great, thank you. So, Dan, do you have anything to add?
It is completely affiliated in some ways with Extinction Rebellion, but it's a way of actually stepping out. The branding and the colours and things are similar, but it's not supporting peaceful civil disobedience. It allows companies and larger organizations who perhaps through their sponsors couldn't be seen to be doing that to enter into the debate. And it's fantastic that it is getting traction. I mean, it's a bit like how we were able to grow a piece inside the Tate through Culture Declares Emergency, and yet as soon as it leaves the building, it can become something completely other. So I think it's important to keep these balances and getting different organizations, different groups doing different things that have a power to sort of move things in different directions. So yeah, sign up if you can.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about kind of interest groups as well, because people who aren't necessarily interested or engaged on climate change will be part of other communities of interest. I noticed at the weekend we had the first net zero Premier League football game, which, you know, may have been a stunt, but if you're bringing the message to football fans, which is a new audience that may not necessarily always be in the conversation, I think that kind of outreach can really help to kind of broaden the awareness of the issues and the necessary actions.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly bigger issues to be looked at around the film industry, the television industry, sports. Again, these are all really much, you know, these are really big areas. But, you know, I mean, I think what is important is that many people do come, and they have been struggling. Many artists are struggling. Many artists may work within their own kind of studio space. And, you know, I think that there is a definite sense that some people kind of have been struggling to actually find people who understand and are there working to try and understand how they can be articulate or vision, you know, when we talk about system change, what is that? How do we imagine that? How does that come across? What are the stories of change that can be told through the arts and through the imagination, as well as the practicalities that need to be done as well, the necessities that have to be done too. But it's great to have Tate on board, Somerset House, the British film industry, BFI, and they're working with other galleries. So there's a lot more transference of knowledge, insight, you know, kind of difficulties. So this is the good side of what is happening.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather. So if Poppy's Wi-Fi will support us on this, I was thinking the arts to the sciences, and maybe look at the IPCC's recent declaration that humans are definitely driving climate change, and that's been kind of scientifically proven. So I would like to ask Poppy how they can be so certain about that. What's the basis for that?
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me a bit better. I've switched devices and onto my mobile 4G.
That's great.
So
Yes, we
hopefully
can.
that's a bit better. But yeah, so it's quite a big statement that we had out from the IPCC report recently. Obviously, we're all, it's quite a strong statement to say we're unequivocally causing climate change. And I think we've been getting there for a very long time. So AR5 was 95 to 100% confidence, but we couldn't just absolutely nail it. And I think obviously with science, we are very cautious. So most of the time we're running things to 95 or 99% confidence because when we're predicting what's going to happen in the future, we have a lot of uncertainty around that. So to get to that point where we can say, no, this is absolutely humans, is a big, very strong statement. And a lot of that's from the scientific developments that we've been having. So that's coming from improved modeling, from increased data sets that we're just building the whole time. And obviously every time you have another report 5 years later or 7 years later, there's a lot more data. But it's also from the data that we're getting over the most recent period and just being able to see the longer term trends. So looking at things like the last 4 decades where each one has been warmer than the preceding one. So there's a lot of changes that have gone on that have allowed us to say that with real certainty. Multiple different aspects of the climate science are now really very likely saying that it's humans that are driving those changes. And when they're all put together, we've got a very strong, really can't be denied in any sense that it's humans causing the climate change.
And Poppy, to what extent do you think that will now change the discourse?
I hope that we've got that stronger statement, that it will be much more discussion about how we help with the climate crisis rather than people just trying to fight us that it exists. As a climate scientist, one of the questions you get most is, how do we know it's humans? Those kind of things, like people just being unsure. And I think the fact that there is such a strong statement now with all the data kind of supporting it, we should finally be able to move forwards on what the questions we're answering are and start to come up with solutions. That's the way it will go.
And just finally, I mean, COP26 is kind of primarily about carbon emissions, but what are the other associated problems that could be, can't say this word, exacerbated by the changing climate? Yeah,
so I think lots of your audience will be aware of lots of the issues that we're also seeing. So we're seeing mass extinctions. Biodiversity crisis is a huge impact and a huge issue for us all. But also things like how we've been disposing of our waste, habitat fragmentation, and all things like this. They all exacerbate climate change because as we warm climate, if we've got a fragmented habitat or a damaged ecosystem from something else that humans have done to it, it makes other species adjustments in the climate much more difficult. So we then exacerbate our biodiversity loss and prevent our species being able to help themselves in the situation that we've put them in. So we really have to make bold actions for climate to prevent that becoming an even worse problem and making things like some of the other areas get worse, really.
Okay, thank you, Poppy. So bold actions, I think that's something that we Todd. I'm really interested to know how you transitioned from flying passenger jets to becoming an XR activist.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, it was certainly not something I expected when I was 5 years old, watching Southend Air Show, inspired by the Red Arrows and setting my heart on that dream career, growing up in a working class family and, working on a building site at one stage, realizing that dream finally and being able to, finally, achieve that job. I thought all my problems would be solved and I had all the material gains that I thought I needed to be happy in life. And I guess I mentioned earlier having my medical revoked. It was a very difficult time for me to process, and it was actually as a result of being unplugged from that bubble, I guess, and having some time to think in the same way that I think the lockdown enabled people to just stop and really assess. For a brief moment, there was quite a lot of awareness. It didn't last so long, it seems, but Yeah, I think as time moved forward and my knowledge of the climate science grew, what I could see in the environmental movement, at least, is that we had doctors for Extinction Rebellion, lawyers for Extinction Rebellion, all these various professions, but there wasn't much representation from workers in carbon heavy industries. Obviously, there's good reason for that, because for me as a pilot, to stick my head above the parapet and to speak out publicly would be career suicide. And I was still in over £100,000 worth of debt at the time. So I was hugely conflicted about my career choice and not knowing how damaging it was. No one taught me in flight school how bad it was for the environment. But I think, in this critical moment for humanity, once you really grasp what we're experiencing and really how bad this is, then you realize that you have to do all that you can. And I also had a privileged situation in many ways, because Thomas Cook, who I worked for, had a really good health insurance policy. So when I had my medical revoked, I was still getting an income even after Thomas Cook went under. So many of my colleagues had to go out to be relocated to Dubai after Thomas Cook went bust, and a month later COVID happened and they lost their jobs and had to come home. So I felt that I should do something with that, and try and be a part of the solution. So thankfully I met a few more pilots actually who were environmentally aware, and my first XR local meeting I went to in Croydon, there was another airline pilot there, so that completely took me by surprise. And we eventually formed a small group, and I'm the only one that can really speak out publicly. So I try to amplify the voice of others that share in the concerns, and hence why we've formed this worker-led movement now, Safe Landing, because the unions are failing completely. They're just acting as a mouthpiece for industry and big oil, essentially, and they're going to lead us off the cliff of a much bigger crash of the market in 10 years' time if the industry is allowed to expand at the rate that they want it to. So yeah, I've even been arrested with XR now for live streaming a pile of poo-poo that was dumped outside the Daily Mail head office. So it is what it is, and I think my chances of ever getting back into the sector are slim. But I've made the decision. The chances are, the likelihood is that there's not the technology and the paradigm shift. Whether it occurs or not in the next few years is yet to be seen. But just doing all that I can now. I think that the decision's pretty simple, really, when it's just a job title at the end of the day, and this is a future of all life as we know it.
So Todd, how do you think the UK government's Jet Zero programme lines up against the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee and the UK Climate Assembly and the International Energy Agency?
So Jet Zero, every time I hear it, it just makes me cringe. There's so much to say about how deceptive it is. It's one of the government's 10-point plans. But if you look at that entire proposal, if the proposal was entirely successful by 2050, just 4% of the aircraft would be Jet Zero, what they call zero emissions aircraft, and that would be electric aircraft. And yes, it might electric aircraft, even if they achieve that 4% by 2050, they call it zero emissions because that's from the point of flight, but you're still putting energy from the grid, which is fossil fuels primarily at the moment, to power those aircraft, which is, electric aircraft are just make up 5% of the sector. So Jet Zero is just a complete greenwash, and the Committee of Climate Change have recommended demand management, as have the UK Climate Assembly, who recommended a democratic process, recommended a frequent flyer tax levy among a ban on private polluting flights, the private jet flights, and even the International Energy Agency, a very conservative body, have came out and said that long haul growth needs to be capped. Domestic flights should be taken by rail. This is degrowth we're talking about now. European Environment Agency have said that we need to look at post and degrowth policy. So for the UK government to come out and just say that we should carry on business as usual in aviation, technology is going to solve it, and just do absolutely nothing, no tax on aviation kerosene at all, that it's a fossil fuel, is completely tax-free, which benefits, you know, the high income families. You know, if you tax kerosene, the amount the billions you could raise in, you know, you could pay for the retrofit, you know, put it towards public transport, better social care. It's such an easy, simple thing to do. Clearly, we need it at an international level. But yeah, Jet Zero is utter nonsense, and you know, there are really no green solutions in the short to mid-term for many decades. So we just need to fly less and accept that reality. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. So yeah, just a couple of other, just two more really statistics that made me really think. Over 8, I guess, like most people here would have been on a flight at some point in their lives. Over 80% of the world's people have never even stepped foot on an aircraft, but just 1% of the population create 50% of the demand. So it isn't really about, you know, someone that saves up their hard-earned cash, you know, for that one flight down to the Canary Islands. This is about the polluting elite that are getting this, you know, the tax-free benefit of flying regularly, getting rewarded for frequent flying. So it's a pinnacle of injustice, in my opinion.
So Todd, one final question to you, and we'll have to be brief on this one. Should COP26 be a virtual event then, with no people flying into Glasgow?
I think, given that, you know, 1% create 50% of the demand, and what we need to really look at is what flights are essential or not, and to have good representation from all parties around the world at COP is absolutely essential, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't think personally it should be digital, because I think members of the global south would lose out. But it's more about categorizing what flights are essential or not, and that's a real problem. It's not, you know, these climate conferences, that's for sure.
That's great, thank you. So moving to you, continued overview of the press and TV channels reporting on climate change has been quite extraordinary. Do you think the media coverage has changed at all as a result of your campaigning? You're mute, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, so I'm very reluctant to claim credit, but there is no doubt that since this strand of work, the Tell the Truth strand of work, got going at the very tail end of 2017, there has been a very marked shift in the way that the media reports on climate change. Now, the right-wing papers, which previously were denialist papers, no longer publish news articles that question the science. And if there is an alarming statement from David Attenborough or the UN Secretary General, they will generally now report that as a simple item of news. And the BBC, up to 2017, it felt it had an obligation to give balance. So if there was a scientist coming on TV to say that climate change is a serious problem and we need to tackle it, they felt obliged to have a climate change skeptic or a denier come on to the TV or radio. And that has now gone. And that has happened as a result of a series of protests outside the BBC, and also a number of other complaints that have gone in. Huge number of complaints have gone in to try and get the BBC to accept that the science on climate change is so certain that really now we must stop any further input by the denialists. They don't have a place at all. So yes, I think that the Tell the Truth strand of work has had a big impact, but there are a lot of people involved in it, and it's not just me. So the printed media has changed. The Mirror, the Eye, the Guardian regularly publish articles that feature the more frightening elements of the news. They're still reluctant to put in the most frightening details. And the BBC, ITV, they are giving people factual information, statements about, could be a statement by the UN Secretary General now saying that we now face a code red for humanity situation. But again, the BBC and ITV are still reluctant to give people the most frightening items of news. If you want, I could give people a couple of examples. For instance, I'll go to NASA and NOAA are responsible for the climate change predictions. They're based in the United States. A few years ago, they predicted that the Arctic Ocean would be free of ice in the 2060s. And in 2020, they brought forward that prediction to the year 2034. And not only was that not reported on TV or radio, or barely reported on TV or radio, certainly not in news bulletins, the implications have never been explained to people. So once we reach that point, we've got an Arctic-free ocean in the summer when the sun doesn't set for 4 months. Instead of white sea ice reflecting away 90% of the sun's energy, or around about 90% of the sun's energy, it's like my shirt here. From space, open ocean appears black and absorbs nearly 90% of the sun's energy. And it's a tremendous switch. Now, a lot of people in the environmental movement call this the blue ocean event, and they see it as something cataclysmic. Now, Dr. Poppy Harvey may well say, well, it's not quite that bad. We must let her say, you know, explain the position as perhaps as she sees it. But it certainly makes it a hell of a lot harder to meet our 2 degrees Celsius target. The second thing I want to mention, I'll give you another example. Quite recently, the Committee on Climate Change published a risks report in June of this year. And they warned of the disruption to food supplies. On page 51 of the detailed report, it's on their website, it's relatively easy to find. They talk about very serious disruption to food production, dramatic reduction in arable farming output if the AMOC, which is what brings the Gulf Stream to the UK, were to collapse. Now, this is a great issue of scientific concern, and the impact for the UK could be devastating. Now, those 2 pieces of news on the Committee on Climate Change's report didn't make it out into the main news bulletins. Now, how could it be that the UK's body that is responsible for advising government on its policies on climate change, when it warns us that we face definitely disruption to our food supplies, and there is a grave risk of very dramatic reduction in arable farming output, how can it possibly be that people are not told that in their TV and radio news bulletins? So those are 2 simple examples. I've got stacks of examples like this that I can give to people. And this is what I mean when I say that the media is saying far more about climate change than it's ever done before, but it's still holding back on the most frightening elements. Now, the consequence of that is that there are people who are like climate activists who pay a great deal of attention to these issues, and then they're far more likely to go out and campaign on the streets and take risks, like, for instance, being arrested or walking out onto the M25, because they know that the situation is absolutely desperate. But the vast majority of people in this country don't know the really frightening details. And so as a consequence, when the media portrays us as hypocrites, they portray us as crazed lunatics, lots of abuse in the headlines in the newspapers at the moment, then General Joe Public just adopts the attitude of, well, we're extremists and we've lost touch with reality. Whereas in fact, the climate activists are the people who listen very carefully to the science and are deeply concerned, deeply alarmed about what they're hearing. And it's because of that alarm, because of that fear for their loved ones and for humanity and all life on Earth, that they're doing what they do. So I think that the media still has a very profoundly adverse impact upon public opinion. If the public knew the full horror of what is unfolding, they would be far more likely to demand changes from their politicians, and it would also influence the way they vote. So one of the points I often make is that you do not live in a free and open democracy if crucial information is withheld from you that would influence the way you vote. So yeah, that's where we are with the press. As I say, I can give people lots of examples of the really frightening stuff that people need to know. They absolutely desperately need to know when the Committee on Climate Change, for instance, says that arable farming output in the UK will be greatly reduced if the AMOC does stop. Sorry, I've gone on a bit further there. I hope that's helpful.
That's okay. Thank you, Jon. Dan, I can see you want to come in, but I've got one final question for Jon. And if you could make this answer brief for me, Jon, I'd like to know what role you think the media has played in our failure so far to get anywhere near to the COP21 commitments.
Well, obviously, it's withholding the really frightening information. There's that. But then also, the majority of the press will portray efforts to curtail car use as an attack on the motorist. The press will say things like, without aviation, you know, life isn't worth living. You only get a proper holiday if you're flying abroad. Flying abroad broadens the mind. You get a constant stream of messages to people to say that we need to continue with business as usual and we should not be making dramatic sacrifices, and certainly not government policy that ensures that we all make sacrifices together. So I blame the media for pretty much everything that's gone wrong with government policy. And that's why I encourage people to get involved in their lawful protests, these Tell the Truth protests, to come along, get involved in the Tell the Truth protest. And we pick different organisations and we definitely have an impact. So I urge people to get involved in them. That's
great. Thank you, Jon. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say from the little bit of time that I was out on the rebellion up in London and various things over the last few months, compared with when everything first started off with Extinction Rebellion, the public are so much more behind us. I mean, things have really shifted. There has been such a shift. The press probably are fighting back, or we know that they are, but actually public opinion on the streets has shifted. And that's something I really felt, and I felt was a really positive thing, that there are changes happening. People are understanding it. And so, yeah, I think you've got to look at the good things that are coming up, and there are so many things that are happening. So.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that optimism is important, isn't it? Because if you want people to act, they need to believe that what they do is going to make a difference. And so if we focus exclusively on the doom and gloom.
I've certainly felt that the public opinion has shifted enormously just over the last couple of years. So changes are happening. And yeah, we can mitigate what the future might be. Let's see how it goes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. And finally, before we move to the last round of questions, Heather. Oh, you're muted, Heather.
Yeah, carry on with the next round of questions. Yeah. I was going to add something.
No, please do. Okay, so I'm just going to ask a final round of questions to the panel from the chair. But we're very keen to have questions from the audience. So now is the time for you to type your questions into the chat box so that we can put them to the panel. So to give you time to do that, I'm just going to go around with one final round of questions to each of the panel in turn. And the first question is, what chance is there of COP26 being a success? And what would success look like? So if we can start that maybe with Poppy.
Yeah, so I think how you measure success is going to be critical for this, really, and also how the different time periods you're looking at success over. So for me, like in November, COP26 isn't going to be a success unless there are bold actions that are agreed across multiple countries and support for the less developed countries to be able to actually make changes. That needs to be coming from developed countries like our own. So we need to have actions that are actually going to happen, and they need to be holding the government and large businesses to make those changes happen in the future. But obviously we're not going to know how successful we are until we start to see how that's impacting climate down the road. So there's also a case that we need these bold actions, but we won't know they're going to necessarily be successful until we can start to see the impact that they're having on the CO2 emissions that we've got.
Okay, thank you, Poppy. So same question to Todd.
Probably take a little bit more of a pessimistic view, I guess, that you know, the past 25 COPs have failed, and we are where we're at because the process, in my eyes, is fundamentally flawed. That a few countries can veto, often ones that are funded by other countries that have vested interests. So I guess in many ways, for my mental health, it's better to prepare for a failure at COP, because in my eyes that's the likely outcome, and what's more important is what happens beyond COP. And you know, for a long period in my own journey, I thought that, you know, COP26 that was going to be the pinnacle, that was where it was all going to happen, and to put so much emotional reliance on something is quite dangerous. A lot of people say, you know, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And yeah, we just got to carry on showing up in the best way that we can, making sure that what we're doing is sustainable, and we're just, you know, looking beyond really. And yeah, I guess if there was a success for me, it would be you know, a paradigm shift. You know, really, I think we're at the stage. I came across Bystroff's curve graph a few days ago, which is peer reviewed, and it basically says that within 2 or 3 years, you know, we are in the middle of a we're just at the beginning of a population collapse, and a business as usual scenario has, you know, 1 billion people left on this planet. There's just so many factors, you know, that combine to, you know, multiple breadbasket failure, biodiversity, you name it. So I guess when you hold that in your mind, you know, that we're in collapse, a success for me would be like what happened in the States after they bombed Pearl Harbor. Within 2.5 months, I think they turned around their economy. We need a mobilization that, you know, we just make this the absolute priority, rewild, and you know, yeah, a complete paradigm shift, and to avoid the worst of it, you know, because it's coming either way.
Heather, would you like to answer next?
Well, I think when you read what John Kerry, you know, the US Climate Envoy, is saying that 50% of the carbon reductions needed to get to net zero, and we know there's a lot of criticism of the whole notion of net zero, Kerry says has to come from technologies that have not yet been invented. I mean, and people don't have to give up a quality of life in order to cut emissions. I mean, this is, you know, one of the biggest polluters, you know, on the planet is there. You know, this man is in his 70s. He is an experienced climate, so said envoy and speaker. So no, that gives me very little. That gives me very, very little comfort. Just talking about what John was saying earlier about telling the truth and the really, really scary stories. Last year, I read in New Scientist, and it sort of said, you know, the other crisis being climate change, being knocked off the picture because of COVID-19. Corinne Leclerc, who's a very brilliant scientist, based at University of East Anglia, formerly of the Tyndall Centre. She's a research professor of climate change science. And she said, I mean, she nailed it. She said, okay, to keep the temperature at 1.5 degrees centigrade every year between now and 2030 has to be like January to June of 2020, when the world ceased making industry, ceased driving, ceased flying, ceased being business as usual. And so that is very, very deeply sobering. And there is just no way any politician is going to get up and say that, because they do not know how to even to begin to bring in a form of economy that will allow people to live without our industry firing in. And, you know, last year between July and December, the carbon emissions were nearly equal to 2019, which is a highest on record. So no, I think that I'm preparing for, I'm not even preparing for disappointment, to be honest. I'm trying to understand really what can be done both on the ground, through culture, where I feel I have voice, or where I feel I can bring something. Alliances definitely are very, very important, without a doubt. So that's my take on it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Dan, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Heather. I think I mean, there have been changes. There are changes happening. I don't think, the way when the gavel went down in Paris, it seemed things were changing. We know the reality of that. Whatever comes out of this, we know that those decisions are being taken now, probably. I think culturally, with some of the protests that are going on, things are shifting. And however much, it might not be quite enough. I unfortunately think it's not going to be enough, but it's mitigating the harm, and anything extra we can do is going to make that better. So I just feel that we've just got to do what we can and keep doing it in every way we can, with every organization that's pushing forward. And we're going to make it better. It might not be perfect, but we're going to make it better. So let's keep doing it.
That's great, thank you, Dan. I think that kind of reflects my own position on that too. And finally, Jon.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Yes, so in particular, I pick out Todd and Fiona with what they've said there, that we're almost certainly going to fail at COP26. Success is to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. The second target that was agreed at COP21 is to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius. And we're not going to have anything announced at COP26 that's going to get us close to 1.5 or to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So success would be to certainly hit 1.5. But the very painful message I have to give to people is the same message I think that Extinction Rebellion Heading for Extinction Talk gives to people. And that is that extreme suffering is now locked in, but we still have time to avoid the very worst outcomes. The very worst outcomes could be runaway climate change, where a series of climate feedbacks keep on hitting us, they keep on driving up temperatures, and no matter what we do, we still can't bring temperatures down. We still can't draw enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to stabilize climate. Ultimately, we could end up with a climate equivalent to the Eocene era, when temperatures were 12 to 16 degrees Celsius hotter than they are today. And that's death. That is death for virtually all life on the planet, and certainly all advanced life on the planet, all complex life on the planet. So what I would say to people is that we can still avoid those very worst outcomes, but we have to act now. Now, COP26 will fail, but we still have to keep on fighting, because as every year goes by, we have to dig deep and we have to demand more cuts and more cuts and more cuts, and climate repair. We barely touched on that tonight, but we also have to battle for climate repair. That's your rewilding and planting trees and many, many other techniques, restoring peat bogs. It's all now about limiting the scale of the damage. It's a very bleak message that groups like Extinction Rebellion give to people, but we have to have courage, we have to face this, and we have to limit the harm.
Thank you, Jon. So we have questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to move on to those now. If the panel could just indicate questions, and I will come to you in turn. So the first question, which is from, sorry, I've lost the name. The first question is from Lisa, and it is: apart from protesting and making personal choices about things like flying and food, what should we be doing to wake people up to the climate emergency? So Todd, I can see you're keen to take that one.
Thanks, Tracy. I think the best thing that anyone can do and that we can do as advocates is to try and get people to learn how to, well, teach themselves how to think critically. The Finnish government taught their citizens how to think critically. And as a result of that, they got a net zero at 2030 target. And yeah, I just think if we can empower people to do their own research, because misinformation is rife, to go out and really understand this and go on their own journey with the knowledge, then hopefully that's enough for them to really feel the emotions required to take the action that's necessary.
Great answer. Thank you, Todd. I can see Heather nodding along with you. Would anyone else like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I would. I think criticality, I would also put creativity and compassion, those 3 C's, you know, to kind of take us away from carbon emissions and climate change. I would like to pick up as well on Jon's point about rewilding, and I put a link into Half Earth as well, E.O. Wilson's, which I'm sure many people who are listening are familiar with. But conservation, but not just trying to, but you know, just I think again everything that can be done on a local level as well, around really increasing biodiversity through the gardens, through the parks, you know, not using weed killers. All of these things are all part of the bigger picture. But I think regeneration of habitat, and there's some great work that's going on through different agencies throughout this country and further afield as well, that you know, just bringing this beautiful blanket bog back into being in Wales, working with farmers and curlews, you know, are coming back. And so these are beautiful little gems and jewels that we need to celebrate and need to support as much as we can, you know. So yes, I think digging for life. Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. Does anyone else have anything to add on that? Jon?
All right, I think I'm unmuted already. So I would say that people should be politically active. I hope you don't mind me saying that I'm actually a member of the Green Party, and it's quite possible that people may prefer to join some other political party or be politically active in some other way. But I think that it is crucial that people become politically active and push through the political party of their choice radical action on climate change. Certainly there's progress that could be made with the Labour Party and the Lib Dems to make their policies much more dynamic, and obviously same too applies to the Conservatives. And then the other thing is that there are lots of initiatives that are going on. I certainly haven't got time to explain it in detail, but a group that I work with, Climate Genocide Act Now, has done something quite remarkable, which is to attempt to prosecute 3 British Prime Ministers for crimes against humanity and genocide in connection with their policies that are causing climate breakdown. It's worked its way through the UK processes with the police and appeal bodies declining to investigate it, despite the fact we have legislation that allows us to do that. And it now is sitting with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, there are some very imaginative campaigns and campaign actions that do not necessarily involve you protesting on the street, that do involve you using the legal processes, entirely lawful, that you can join and you can get involved in, and we can make things like this much stronger, more powerful, not just in the UK, but abroad as well. Because there will come a time when there will be people brought to trial in court. The mock COP26 group of young activists that met recently, they adopted a treaty, and they said that they would, in due course, adopt a law of ecocide. And they said that the penalties to be applied against people who, upon conviction, had to match the severity of the impacts that the criminal has caused. Now, just think what the penalties might be for killing 1 million people or 100 million people. So there is work that needs to be done here, a lot of work. There are lots of different strands that are open to us. So let's all keep in touch. Let's get contact with each other after this meeting and see the other strands of work that can be carried forward.
That's great. Thank you, Jon. So we have another question from the audience. This one's from Adam. And he says, what's your call to action for people listening to this discussion? What 3 things would you recommend that we do? Who'd like that one?
Can I hop in on that one?
Of course you can.
Yeah, so I think it follows on from kind of the last question a bit, but really I think your call to action, you as an individual, is to really educate yourself as much as you can the whole time. Again, it's as Todd was saying, we've got to think critically. We've got to be holding people to that. So the more you can understand, then the more you can engage with the conversation, and the more you can lead you know, if you've got a friend who are more skeptical on things, you can explain things to them and make them more aware of something. Again, awareness is always what we're trying to improve. And a lot of people are scared of talking about climate change, I think, in some of my experiences in life. So you have to really lead that conversation the whole time. And that could be just with your friend when you're having a coffee, or that can be to a whole room full of people. But so that would probably be my first point. But then again, my next call to action is you've got to keep talking about it and getting out there. And then I suppose my final one is vote with your purse, and yeah, think about where you're voting politically as well. Like how you're living your life does have an influence, and it can be frustrating if that it doesn't feel like it's going very far with government inaction and inertia sometimes, but you have got a voice, and we all have to use that because we're much louder together.
That's great, thank you, Poppy. That's really strong. So I have another question here, which kind of builds on the above question from Debbie, saying, what specifically can we do around COP26? And in particular, what can we do if we're going to be there? Todd?
I mean, yeah, to me, it's like what I've been doing the last couple of years, really. If you're not already involved in non-violent direct action, or, you know, a local environmental group, and then, you know, find out who you can get involved with. You know, if you have a niche, then, you know, perhaps go towards your strengths, but you know, there's many out there. It's not just XR, but I think absolutely non-violent direct action is the only thing that's going to change the course of history for the positive. Although, you know, it's not popular right now. I think, you know, the tides are turning. So yeah, just get involved and act from a place that's grounded in reality. And, you know, I'm a bit of an empath. You know, I feel the pain of this on a visceral level. You know, the people that are already dying from this. So if you can try and connect to that, then it really helps to give you the motivation to get out there and do what you can.
Thanks, Todd. Heather?
You know, I just think the whole theatre in this all the catharsis that has been realised at times through these extraordinary actions, through Extinction Rebellion over the last 2 years, you know, it's just extraordinary. I mean, just the arrival of pink boats in Oxford Circus, the red people, you know, the bamboo structures. It's so full of imagination, strength, cooperation, wit, but always suffused with the knowledge that tragedy is here. And we're witnessing it when we turn the TV on, when we speak to other people. It is here, but I think that ability to turn it through the power of imagination. And I really do think that the legacy of what we're doing now is extraordinary. And I think there are more extraordinary actions that are going to happen. So I think find allies, use imagination. Don't be fearful. Let's not be fearful. Let's be brave, and let's be very bold.
I like that. Let's be brave and bold. Fantastic. Jon, you have something to say.
Yes, so again, agree with Heather and Todd. I would say, though, that remind people, let's do more of these tell the truth protests in the lead up to COP26. They are lawful, outside the offices of major news outlets, broadcasters and papers, and ensure that we're putting pressure on the media to tell the public the truth in the lead up and during COP26. So that's a major side to it. Then the other thing is that there are some marches going on, protests that people are taking in the lead up to COP26. People can get involved in the walks to COP26, to Glasgow, in marches, or they can support them in some way. And as Heather says, the more colourful that the receptions are, the more noise that's made when the marchers arrive in your town or village, the better. And as Heather says, you know, people are so creative, they're so witty. And we should be doing more of that. We should be making far more noise about what's going on in the lead up to COP26, and do everything we possibly can to get the media to allow us to put far more pressure on the politicians to deliver. Every single ton of carbon dioxide that we can stop going into the atmosphere probably saves somebody's life. We have to do it.
Brilliant, thank you, Jon. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? Okay, we have another one. So from Lucy, she says it's all going to cost. So presumably by this she means the carbon abatement. So how do we finance that across the globe? That's a big question, isn't it? Who'd like it? Heather.
I have this utopian vision, and why not? You know, and when you, I mean, in 2014, when Oxfam did that extraordinary bit of research saying that at that time, 63 billionaires hold the combined wealth of, 3.5 billion at that time of the world's poorest. It's a shattering statistics, really. And my utopian vision is, and I just think, imagine that we roll out a credit across the globe to make sure everybody has food to eat. They don't have to go and poach. They don't have to go and murder people. I know it's utopian, but sometimes I just think we should never be fearful to stop having really, really big thoughts about how this could go. And I'm sure there are other economists who are working on this as well. And okay, so this is where I'll kind of go into a slightly, it is quite late, but I'll go into a slightly more, and I sort of think we live apparently within a classical physics world, but there's a whole sub-quantum level at times. And I do believe that the universe is this extraordinary living, breathing presence around us. And I believe that we know just a tiny, tiny bit of really the knowledge and the adaptations that are out there. And whenever I feel down, I get out to nature. I really do. I just draw and I breathe on nature. And I just sometimes think, sometimes maybe something really extraordinary may happen.
I love that optimism. I can't remember whose hand was up. Let's go to Jon. Put your hand back up if you had something to say on this.
Okay, so quickly from me, the young don't just have to pay for carbon removal and all the costs associated with climate breakdown. They have to pay for loss and damage compensation to the countries on the front line of climate breakdown. So there's no way that the great mass of people in the UK can afford that bill. It's just beyond our means. There is only one group in society that can afford that bill, and that is the super rich. So we do need a wealth tax. That's what we need, and there's just no other way we're going to get around this. The great bulk of people can no longer afford to carry the super rich, and we have been carrying them. And there is an answer to all of the problems that we face in terms of finance, and that is we need that wealth tax. We need much higher levels of taxation upon people who are making hundreds of millions and billions of pounds and dollars. That is obscene. It's just got to stop because it is crushing everybody on the planet.
So Todd, how would you fund it?
Yeah, just to add to what Jon and Heather have said, really, the top 50 companies have more money than the top 50 states. So it's clear that, our states serve the billionaires that own these companies. So yeah, taxing the super rich. And I think it's also important to remember that, if or when societal collapse happens on our current trajectory, the money has no value anyway. There's this whole insurance bubble where, eventually the insurance companies can't, they won't insure a house in Australia because of the continued wildfires and whatnot. And, it's vulnerable. So I think the billionaires only have status because of their wealth currently. If we could bring them on board and if they need to maintain their narcissistic ways and still be valued in society, then once we recognize that we're in collapse already and that they're not serving us, then perhaps they'll have some grandiose gestures and can actually help us. But yeah, maybe that's a utopian view as well. I think, am I right in saying during the Second World War, 90% of the rich were taxed 90%? So it's entirely possible if we have that mentality that this is existential, it's an emergency, and we're facing extinction. We always talk about these, we say these words, but we don't feel them, and I think that's what's missing.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Is there anybody else who would like to come in on this question? And does anyone in the audience have any final questions? because we are shortly to wrap up. So if you have a burning question that's been there and itching under your fingernails, please type it in and we will ask the panel. Any final thoughts on how we cover the cost?
Just sorry, but just to add, obviously the GDP that we currently chase as being the only measure of success, if we support the wellbeing economy petition that Caroline Lucas is tabling, there are other ways to organise our political economy, put a value on the nature and our health and well-being. That should be, so yeah, I think just a complete, thinking outside the box and really feeling and believing that another world is possible.
Thank you, Todd. Dan, you have something?
Yeah, just to say, the amazing thing about nature, when the environment is right for it, it thrives and it grows and it does what it needs to do. We've been taking away from that for so long, but a little bit of a shift and things come back. So I think it's important to realize nature is strong. We just need to shift things rather than taking away to start to develop those environments, and they can return very quickly, actually. But yeah, we need change.
Wonderful, thank you, Dan. So I'm going to ask one final question to the panel, and back to COP26. So I'd like to know, what do you think are the main obstacles to the success of COP26? Who'd like to pick that up? Jon, thank you.
Okay, so I've already mentioned the media. I think that's a really crucial part of it. And I'm going to keep this very brief and just simply say that it's the billionaires that control the media and control the national agenda and effectively control politicians. Those are the main obstacles. We need them to realize that the only way the youngest members of their families are safe is if we are all safe.
I like that, thank you. Todd, you have something to say?
And yeah, just to add to that, ultimately, whatever happens at COP, the government are going to spin it as a success, as they are spinning the Jet Zero as a success. So just important to recognise that when that happens, as the media will obviously back, this greenwash, but we see it for what it is.
Thanks, Todd. Heather, what do you think are the main obstacles?
Probably lots of bamboo structures outside some of the lesser.
We've got people in the audience who built those.
Fantastic. I think they're fantastic, really. Yeah. I'm going to pass on that point.
Okay, all right, thank you. Poppy or Dan, do you have anything that you'd like to say about the obstacles?
I'll just hop in and say it's what follows COP, really. It's not just COP itself, it's the relationships between international collaborations and governments over the next year, as those policies should be getting implemented, if we hope that they will be. It's what happens at that point if those actually come to fruition eventually.
Yeah, really good point, because it doesn't really finish with COP26, does it? It kind of starts. And Dan, I don't know if you're with us at the moment, but we'll be delighted to hear from you if you have anything to say. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to thanking our panel for your contributions. I think it's been a really great discussion. I found it really fascinating as chair, and I hope the audience have equally enjoyed it. Can we just say a big thank you to our panel in the traditional way? So to Todd, Heather, Dan, well, thank you. And I'm just going to share a slide with you. I mean, this event is part of the Reading Climate Festival, which is organised to inspire and encourage positive action on climate change. And our message is that everybody can do something. And I think, as we've heard earlier on from the panel, you know, there is an issue that lots of people don't know what they can do, and there's this kind of rabbit in the headlights effect of, you know, they want to do something but they're not sure what. So one of the things we're really keen to do is make sure that we give people really easy and clear information about what they can do, and we also try and encourage people to sign up to some commitments. And so I'm going to share with you now a little slide that's got the URL for Reading Climate Action Network, where you can find lots of useful information for both individuals and organisations about what you personally can do to help reduce your carbon emissions and get Reading closer to its target of net zero by 2030. So I would like to thank you all so much for taking part, for attending, for answering questions, and to Kate and XR Reading for organising. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. Have a really great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
Yep, cheers, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, hi, Rachel.
Thank you so much.
Was that okay?
Oh no, I thought it was great, and I'm so pleased that the attendees came up with some of their own questions as well, and the way the panel responded I thought was